let's talk about NFTs. Obviously, everyone seems to have woken up to this, whether it was Beeple's kind of $69 million sale at Christie's. Now there's this artist pact at Sotheby's, and then obviously all of the volume that's going through some of these other exchanges that are kind of digital native. What's your take on what's happening? What questions do you have? What concerns or what are you excited about?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we've gone through this whole process that everyone's gone through, which is like, what is going on to kind of trying to rationalize it in our own head. When the Beeple thing first happened, to be totally transparent, I mean, I was having conversations with lots of friends where I thought it was just this price fixing thing, right? Like someone was pretending to buy this digital work of art for $70 million. Beeple is actually being paid $69.9 million in a back room to try to, create this market for digital art. But after talking to Christie's and the people that work there, it seems like that definitely wasn't the case. I think there were more than 30 bidders registered on that work. None of them were known to the auction house prior to the auction. It seemed, you saw the videos of him watching the sale. Like it definitely seems like that was a real transaction, and it seems like digital art and NFTs are here, at least for the short term. So we find it really interesting from a lot of different ways. Like one of the things that our investors ask us a lot is, hey, we're really interested in this blue chip segment of the market, which outperforms the S&P, has low loss rates. That's a great allocation for our portfolio. But how do we get access to stuff that's more speculative? And I think this is an interesting way for investors to speculate in the art market, which hasn't, frankly, been available before, right? Like there's never been a segment of the art market that you can make returns like you've seen with NFTs. I mean, I think that also comes with a lot of risk, and I don't know how to think about these prices and everything right now, but it's definitely the most speculative segment of the art market right now.
You talked a little bit about like the people who were registered for the Christie's auction. Almost all, if not all of them, were unknown to the auction house. And so do you look at this as basically, this isn't so much the art market, is evolving. This is literally just net growth to art in general, and this kind of digital natives, both the platforms, the artists, and the art investors?
Yeah, with one exception. So we do know, I mean, I know of two very well-known artists right now who I can't say their names, but they're working on NFTs. So there's artists themselves have clearly woken up to what's going on. I think collectors are still divided, right? Like the people that are investing in or buying NFTs are not the same people that are investing in or buying blue chip art. So I think those are two different universes. Maybe those Venn diagrams overlap at some point, but right now they're pretty distinct.
Yeah. And so when you start to look at this, I know that there's still kind of a moving target, right? Do these prices make sense? What are the use cases? But when you look at it, maybe what's like the rationalization you're telling yourself, right? So if I had to say, hey, be the NFT bull, how do you think about it? And what do you say to people who are skeptical?
Yeah, so I think this is a very hard question, and if we go back to basic fundamentals of how markets are created and how markets are sustained, all markets have to have some sort of framework in which they operate. I was actually having this conversation with our general counsel earlier, and the art market, there's a clear understanding between institutions and collectors around what's important, what's historically significant, which artists did what things first. And they sort of have these places in history, what we refer to as cultural significance. And there's a correlation between cultural significance and price. And many of these artists also are they're deceased or they've been painting for decades. And you have this long track record of representation between galleries and prices at auction, et cetera. So there's this entire framework of which you can establish price. I think for me, the question is with the Beeple sale in particular, it is what happened culturally significant, and I think you can argue that in different ways. And is that precedent for the artist and for future prices of the artist? We see this with lots of artists, right? There's tons of artists that we see in the art market all the time that go from very unknown artists to having, I wouldn't say a $70 million sale, but maybe a $1 million sale, and then everyone's asking, is this now $1 million artist? So that's not uncommon. I just think the magnitude of the $70 million is what really shocked everyone.
And so in that kind of historical example where there is that $1 million sale and then people start asking, is this $1 million artist? How do you normally think through that, right? Like, are there certain frameworks or data points that you look at to kind of determine, is this a kind of outlier sale, or has the artist actually, increased the value, if you will, of all their pieces?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So if you look at artists in the secondary market, and the secondary market is really, you think of the art market divided into two different segments: primary market, which is where artists are painting new paintings and selling them through galleries, and the money goes back to the artist; and the secondary market, where paintings are resold over time between multiple collectors. Generally, in the secondary market, most of these artists have long track records. So you're analyzing similar paintings that have sold historically, how prices have increased over time. And with certain artists like Basquiat, for example, I mean, Basquiat's prices shockingly have gone up roughly 18% a year for almost 20 years, right? It's just this very predictable market that continues to increase. With artists that don't have that track record, usually what you're asking yourself is, how culturally significant is that artist? And I would say there's not a clear definition of cultural significance. Cultural significance to us means three different things. One, who is that artist exhibited with? Like, have they been associated with other great artists? Two, what institutions collect that artist? What museums collect that artist? And then three, how global is the demand for that artist? But it's hard to apply that definition of cultural significance to what we're seeing in the NFT space.
Yeah. If you had to make a guess as to how the cultural significance can be applied, like that filter, that perspective, where would you start with the NFTs? Is it just trying to figure out like who owns this artist, who's promoted them, what podcasts have they done? Like, just how would you try to figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's right. I mean, I think you would almost look at like Google Trend data, right? Like what's the share of voice for a particular artist in kind of the digital ecosystem? How is that share increasing or decreasing? The Beeple example is somewhat unique, and that's really almost the first very well-known example of an NFT sale, right? So that in itself kind of has cultural significance, or I think does have cultural significance. But yeah, I think since this art is digital and really all of the transactions are digital, you sort of have to redefine what is cultural significance.
Yeah, and it also feels like in the traditional world, a lot of the data points that you described in terms of where they've been exhibited, what institutions are collecting, that all seems to be very kind of analog world, right? Which would make sense for traditional art in kind of the analog world. Before we started, we were talking about what some folks are doing in the NFT space is they're trying to buy digital art, and then they're going to essentially display it in these digital worlds, these digital museums or whatever. And so while that is not prevalent today, if that does become prevalent, it's almost a digital recreation of a lot of the same, kind of data points, if you will, right? In terms of the institutions or the digital museums that are collecting may become a signal as well.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. And we're thinking through the same things, right? Like, what are the use cases for NFTs? And you mentioned one, which is digital museums, which I hadn't heard of that one. I think that's super interesting. The other is just, how do you have devices actually display NFTs in homes so people can, outside of a laptop, kind of consume the art. The other thing that I've wondered a lot about is, how do artists' copyrights work with NFTs, or do they work with NFTs? I think that's really interesting, right? Like the idea that maybe anyone could consume an NFT if there is a fee. Is there some sort of like brokering or sale of a copyright of an NFT to a marketplace of buyers? I think that's really interesting as well. So it's super early days. I mean, we're interested in it. It's very hard to tell where it goes from here, but it does seem like it could be a new segment of the art market that people really haven't thought that much about.
And when you think about copyright, unpack that a little bit more in terms of how you think about copyrights in the legacy art market, and then what you're thinking about in this kind of digital art market.
Yeah, so many people don't realize this, but if we buy a painting at Masterworks, let's say we buy a $25 million Basquiat, we don't actually own the copyright to that painting. That's owned by the Artist Foundation. So independent of ownership, the copyright is something that's separate and distinct. So how copyrights have been licensed historically and how that whole industry works is pretty antiquated. Most people that own copyrights, they basically generate revenue was they find people that are violating the copyrights, they hire an attorney to go after the person, they negotiate, they settle, and that's how they make money. It seems like to me there could be some interesting correlation between NFTs and copyrights here that could make more sense.
Yeah. And it almost feels like in some weird way, one of the reasons why artists are so excited about NFTs, it appears, is because they essentially can code into the tokens that they'll get a royalty stream, right? Kind of a 10 or 20% on each future sale of their piece. And so copyright may be kind of intertwined in that in some way. Maybe it's a little different than it is in the traditional market, but it's a way for them to at least monetize much better the secondary market than they have as a way today.
Yeah, I think that's right. The other thing that we've just been thinking a lot about relative to NFTs is this, I think it's almost theoretical, just this concept of scarcity. So we fundamentally know that in the art market, one of the things that drives returns is scarcity. And the example that I always like to use with people is Jackson Pollock. So, Pollock during his lifetime painted all these drip paintings, many of which are $100 million paintings today. But throughout history, after he died, all of those paintings were essentially donated to institutions, except for what I think are 21 paintings now. So out of those 21, there's only a couple left that are great paintings. Most are, I wouldn't say bad examples, but B or C examples. But the B or C examples are selling for $20 million, $30 million, $40 million, because if you want a Jackson Pollock drip painting, that's all that's left. So I do think what's happened here is digital art combined with blockchain has created this element of scarcity, which is really interesting. And historically, that's what's driven art prices as well.
Yeah. And I guess the big piece that people don't understand also about the traditional art market is kind of the appraisal process, or what I'll call the infrastructure around art. So most people think of a market as just there's the artist, there's the investor, the buyer, and that's pretty much it. Maybe just touch on a little bit, how you guys leverage some of that infrastructure, the appraisals, and then how, if any, thoughts around, how that translates into the digital art market.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the easiest way that I tell people to think about how artwork is valued is to think about real estate, which most people are familiar with. So if you buy a house, you generally get an appraisal before you get a mortgage on a house. So art is the exact same. You go to major appraisal firms that appraise paintings, and they appraise paintings because for most of these great artists, there's similar paintings that are selling reasonably frequently, I call it at least once a year. And they can kind of look at the trends and those prices of similar paintings over time and arrive at a value. With NFTs, I don't know how that works, right? Because you have such a short time period, there really isn't a history of comparables to value something. But the thing that is interesting, the thing that's most interesting to me about the Beeple sale was the number of bidders, right? Because you have two bidders on a painting that goes to $70 million, you can say, oh, there's two people that are crazy. Here you had 30 people, and 30 bidders on anything in the art world is unheard of, right? You don't have 30 bidders on a $25 million Basquiat, right? Like you might have 6 bidders if it's a really great example and there's a lot of demand for a painting, but you never have 30. So the depth of bidding for that work in general is super interesting and does indicate that there's real value there, at least at a minimum, to those 30 people.
Yeah. And when you think about that, I don't want to ask you to speculate too much, but just why do you think it brought so many more people than, kind of traditionally it would? Is it just, it's the first one, and so naturally people all want to kind of be a part of it, or is there some other reason?
I think it's the first mover dynamic. I guess that, so the optimist would say it's a first mover dynamic. The cynic would say whoever bought the work owns 100 other works by Beeple. And, he just marks the market for all of the other works that he owns. Could be both, who knows?
Yeah, I'm very, very interested to see what the Beeple pieces start to do in the secondary market now, given such a high price point, right? Do they actually materially move up or not? When you think about Masterworks and the business today, obviously there is a ton of interest that has kind of increased because of the macro environment and asset inflation, and the desire to use that store of value through art. Are you also seeing or feeling any kind of increase in just traditional art because of NFTs? Like almost like a Streisand effect where people are talking more and more about art in general. And so it's also bleeding into the traditional market.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting. I mean, our membership team has hundreds of calls a day with investors who are interested in Masterworks, and I mean, almost all of those calls now are you know, have some NFT question or comment. I think it's funny that, like, to me, it's amusing because, like, the person asking the question doesn't really know what they're talking about. The person on our membership team doesn't really know what they're talking about. So it's kind of like, you know, the game of telephone that you play when you're a child, where like people just start saying things and it doesn't really mean anything in the end. But definitely, it's generated a huge amount of interest in art and investing in art.